Okay, this will be a video about the psychic surgery craze of the 1960s, which is just one of the more incredible things of all time. It's a really fascinating topic. So, what exactly was it? Like, what are psychic surgeons? And basically, in the 1960s, there were these people who were referred to as psychic surgeons, and they started to become very popular for a stretch of time. And they were called psychic surgeons because they claimed they could enter a trance and have a spirit take over their body. And then, while they were possessed and in this trance, they had these superhuman healing abilities. And they would operate on people while they were in these trances, do everything from perform major surgeries like open heart surgery to minor surgeries to even prescribing like remedies and medications. And again, while they were possessed, they weren't in control of their bodies or their actions. It was the spirit that took over their body that performed these surgeries. And maybe it sounds hard to believe or kind of far out there, but the whole point is that this psychic surgery thing got really popular, almost mainstream for a stretch of time in the 1960s. And all these people, all these psychic surgeons were in third world countries. They were all foreign. And in a lot of these countries, like psychic surgery wasn't a weird or abnormal thing. It was very common. It was accepted. It had been going on for decades. And the interesting thing is, in the 1960s, this phenomenon really started to become pretty popular in like the United States and the Western world during this time. And there were all these stories in newspapers and magazines of people from America and Europe who'd gone to these foreign countries to have this psychic surgery done, to have major operations done. And then they would return to the US after getting the surgery and told all these unbelievable stories. Blind people saying they could see now, paralyzed people saying they could walk, cancerous tumors removed, just really amazing stuff. And the craziest part was just the descriptions of these surgeries themselves. There's just all these wild stories and books and newspaper articles about these surgeries and the procedures that these psychic surgeons were performing. They just totally defy the laws of physics, defy the laws of science, defy the laws of basically like reality almost. I mean, some of the stories are just unbelievable. So these psychic surgeons, they usually, they were all in third world countries. They usually operated out of some like hut or shack or back room in the middle of nowhere. It was totally unsanitary. There were flies and mosquitoes everywhere. They never used anesthesia. They never sterilized their equipment. And just the process itself is almost too incredible to be believed. Basically, what would happen was the psychic surgeon would just look at a patient, diagnose them at a glance without even knowing anything about them or running any tests. And then right then and there, they would perform surgery. And it was everything from major surgeries to minor surgeries. And a lot of times, these surgeons would perform the surgery in just like a minute or two. They would just set a person down, slice them open, pull out a tumor, and send them on their way. And again, it sounds pretty incredible, but it gets even more incredible, trust me. Like, none of these people had medical training or any sort of medical background. Most of them had like a third grade education. And again, it was the spirit that was possessing them that was performing these surgeries and making these diagnoses and doing these operations. And one of the crazier parts is that these surgeries would never leave any sort of scar. The wounds would never get infected or anything like that. They would just open the person up, pull a tumor out or something like that, whatever the operation was. And then when they were done, they would just wave their hand over the incision and it would just heal on its own instantly. And after these surgeons started getting kind of really popular and word started spreading about all these crazy stories and all these insane operations that were happening, doctors from the US got interested and went abroad and started studying these psychic surgeries. And these are just a few quotes from people who went over there. How he operated without blood, pain, stitches, or scars can't be explained rationally. It all sounds impossibly far-fetched, said one doctor, but I've witnessed some operations and seen the results. It is all impossible, and yet it happens. And this passage from this book, Arigo. So Arigo was one of the main psychic surgeons of the time. He was very popular for a stretch. He was out of Brazil. And this is a passage from a book that was written about him, about an American doctor who went over to study Arigo. And he wrote about what he witnessed the first time he walked into the little shack that Arigo worked out of. And he says, suddenly and without ceremony, Arigo roughly took the first man in line. Without a word, Arigo picked up a 4-inch stainless steel paring knife with a Cocobolo wood handle and literally plunged it into the man's left eye, under the lid and deep into the eye socket. Arigo began violently scraping the knife between the ocular globe and the inside of the lid, pressing up into the sinus area with uninhibited force. The man was wide awake, fully conscious, and showed no fear whatsoever. He did not move or flinch. A woman in the background screamed, another fainted. Then Arigo levered the eye so that it extruded from the socket. Within a few moments, Arigo withdrew the paring knife from the eye, bringing out with a smear of pus on the point. Then he called for the next patient. The entire examination had lasted less than a minute. And again, these patients, as they were being operated on, they were wide awake the entire time. They could literally look down and like watch the surgeon operating on them, watch their stomachs being opened up and their guts being rearranged. This is another passage from a separate book written about psychic surgery, about someone recounting their experience having this done. And so they say, his hands broke right through my skin as if it were no thicker than water, and he poked around inside me with his fingers. I didn't feel any pain. I was wide awake. I could raise my head up and look right at his hands squishing my blood around, but I didn't feel a thing. Then he pulled this big hunk of tissue out of me right before my eyes. He grinned and showed it to me, then casually tossed it into a wastebasket. And there's just all these amazing quotes. It really was really popular for a stretch in the 1960s. And there's so many amazing quotes from people who went to these third world countries and had these psychic surgeons perform on them and just came back just basically in awe of what they'd experienced. People saying, I think he's the greatest healer since Christ. I feel though I've been in the presence of God. I saw what I would call a miracle. It's all beyond me. I mean, people were just totally baffled by this whole phenomenon. There were a number of books written around this time about these psychic surgeons and kind of trying to make sense of like how this actually worked. There were articles in like major newspaper or major magazines, major publications. This one's from Time Magazine. And then there's also video of these operations that exist as well. And one interesting thing is that these psychic surgeons not only allowed people to bring video recording equipment and cameras to the operation and take pictures and video of what was being done, but the psychic surgeons encouraged it. They were totally fine with that. You can find these videos online. Um, I won't show them. They are extremely graphic. Um, but typically then most of these are from YouTube. Archive.org has a few as well. You can seek those out if you want. And you can find those, but supposedly there was just way more video footage and pictures of these surgeries. Um, I guess one thing that was kind of common was there would be like information sessions and like meetups at bars and restaurants for people who've had this done and people who were interested in having it done. And the people who'd had it done would like bring their, video of their operation and show it to people and answer questions. And even this highlight from a book about psychic surgery says there were over 200 movies of psychic operations in just the Chicago area alone at this time. So apparently there's way more footage that's out there somewhere. If you know where to find it or have seen it or anything like that, drop a comment in the video because I would definitely love to see it. But the point is, these guys were insanely popular for a while. This is the picture of the waiting room for one of the psychic surgeons. It's just people crammed in there like sardines. And these psychic surgeons literally it was almost like an assembly line. They would treat the first person in line. When that was done, move to the next person, next person, next person. They never sterilized their equipment or anything like that. This is honestly one of the more incredible parts about this, but this got to be so popular. These trips abroad to visit psychic surgeons got to be so popular for a while that travel agencies in the US started booking all-inclusive trip or started offering all-inclusive trips to go visit psychic surgeons in like the Philippines and other third world countries. And so these travel agencies in the US would offer these trips that included airfare and hotel and 2 meals a day, and then just also thrown in was a major surgery by a psychic surgeon as part of your travel package. And, I find it just incredible that this was actually happening, but it was, and it was very controversial. This whole thing was insanely controversial. We'll talk about the controversy that kinda surrounded this a little later in the video. But this all these travel agencies that were offering these all-inclusive packages, all these psychic surgery packages, they eventually got shut down by the FTC just because it was kinda considered so controversial. And basically during this time, there were 3 kind of like main psychic surgeons who were more well known than everyone else. They were almost like the rock stars of this whole thing because all 3 of these people were really very, very popular for a stretch of time, 1960s into the early 1970s. There was Arigo, he was down in Brazil. There was Pachita, she was in Mexico. And then there was Tony Apoyo, and he was in the Philippines. And so I just kinda wanted to tell the story of each one of these 3 people real quick, because their stories are just absolutely, absolutely incredible. And first up is Arigo. He lived in Brazil, and he was a peasant who had no medical training at all, and many people claim he was the greatest psychic healer of all time. And so how his story starts is he was big into this thing called Cardicism, which is sort of like a philosophy that believes in the spirit world and in communication with it. And it was very popular and very common in Brazil throughout the 1950s and 60s. Like holding seances, communicating with the spirit world. That was like what they did. It was just, almost what they did for fun. There was no iPhones or, you know, Netflix, or even a lot of places didn't even have TVs. Um, so what they would do for fun was just, "Hey, let's, have a séance tonight," and they would read up on, summoning spirits and whatnot. But anyway, point is he started getting into this Cardicism very heavily. He started entering these trances where this spirit who identified itself as Dr. Fritz, who claimed he was a deceased German doctor, would just take over Arigo's body. And it got to the point where his psychic abilities became so pronounced and refined that he could just summon this spirit to take over his body at any time, just at will. And this spirit had been dead for like 100 some years, I think, or 50 some years. And so one day Arigo helped a friend who was injured. He went into a trance, and when he was in the trance, this Dr. Fritz helped one of Arigo's friends who were injured, and Arigo started treating people out of this small room, just basically like a plain room. It wasn't like a hospital or anything like that. He would never accept money because he claimed the spirit of Dr. Fritz would abandon him if he profited in any way from his powers. So it eventually reached the point where there was just hundreds of people coming to him every day to be operated on or diagnosed or helped in whatever way. And he would see them all, and he would never try. He couldn't accept money. He would never accept money, or he couldn't accept money at all. And yeah, it reached a point where he was treating like 300 people a day, and he got really popular in Brazil. There were tons of articles about him, constant updates about, people he'd saved or operations he'd done. And it was even said that Arigo was the second most famous person in the entire country of Brazil. That's how big he was for a stretch of time. And the only person in Brazil who was more famous than he was the soccer star Pele, who was, one of the greatest soccer players of all time. And even though he was really popular in Brazil, he was pretty much unknown in the United States until this doctor here, his name is Andrea Puharich. he heard all these incredible stories about like this Arigo guy who would just operate on people, hundreds of people a day, cut them open, pull out a tumor, do whatever they needed to be done, and then just send them on their way after the operation. And so this Andrea Puharich heard these stories and he went down to Brazil to see what was up. And he just kind of describes it here. He said the first exposure to this man, Arigo, this first exposure to Arigo was almost too much to comprehend. It was the first time in my life where I've seen a scene like this, when 1 minute from the time the patient steps up until the time he leaves, he either receives a prescription or an actual operation, and he walks out without any pain or disablement. And then he described like this one operation he witnessed. This is one of the very first things he witnessed Arigo do. Patient came up with a big goiter, and Arigo just picked up the paring knife, cut the goiter open, popped the goiter out, and slapped it in her hand, wiped the opening with a piece of dirty cloth, and off she went. And it hardly bled at all. And, I think I mentioned this, but Andrea Puharich was a doctor. He'd studied at Northwestern. He taught at Duke. He taught at NYU. He was very, very intelligent, real fascinating guy. And, he was just basically left totally stunned, totally speechless. And he was so amazed and just utterly confused by what he was witnessing that he had Arigo remove a little tumor from his arm. He had like some sort of cyst in his arm for a while. It was kind of bothered him, but it wasn't cancerous or anything like that. And so he had Arigo remove this tumor, this cyst from his arm. And he talked about this operation and just the whole experience of meeting Arigo and watching him operate years later in a talk. And I'm actually going to play a couple clips from this talk because it's really a great presentation.
Because he would actually diagnose and treat a patient all within 2 minutes. I mean, everything was that rapid. So they just kept popping by. And then if the patient needed an operation, he would just pick up his knife and ask the person to drop their pants right in front of everybody, or pull up their shirt and carve them open, whatever had to be taken out. And it was absolutely astounding, but I couldn't believe my eyes as I watched it. I'm trained as a medical man. I can't go for this kind of crazy stuff. And my experience with him was, if there ever was a Christ-like figure on earth, he was it. I mean, the way he worked, his dedication, the kindness and love of children, and so on and so on. And
So to say that if there ever was a Christ-like figure on earth, he was it, that's quite the compliment. And another real interesting thing about Arigo is he became really good friends with the president of Brazil. His name was Hulicino Kubitschek. And Kubitschek is an interesting case because he was a doctor himself. He was a surgeon, a very renowned surgeon, before he became president of Brazil. And he had this quote about Arigo from a book written about Arigo. And again, this is the president of Brazil saying, he's talking about Arigo here, I knew about his fantastic prestige from the many prominent people who told me what Arigo had done for them. But being a physician and surgeon myself, I found him so extraordinary that I cannot find words to express it. The people had faith in him. No one could fail to do so. He was a god. So that's obviously quite a quote. And another real interesting thing about Hulicino Kubitschek is that he took his own daughter and had her treated by Arigo. His daughter had a compromised immune system and she got a kidney stone, and it was considered, it could even be potentially life-threatening. It was apparently a pretty big kidney stone. And so he took her to Arigo and had Arigo treat her, and Arigo prescribed some sort of medication to her that cleared the condition right up. Sometimes Arigo would perform surgery, sometimes he would just prescribe medication, and a lot of times the medication he would prescribe like made no sense. It was this very strange combination of medicines and pills and vitamins and whatnot. But anyway, the president of Brazil took his own daughter to be treated by Arigo, and he gave her this prescription, and it cleared up her kidney stone problem. So, and then there was also this guy, Roberto Carlos. He was a singer in Brazil, and he was considered even more popular, or maybe just as popular as the Beatles in Brazil. He was a major, major star. And what happened was his son was born with a serious condition, it was some sort of glaucoma thing, where he was basically blind. And so they took their son all around to Europe and the United States to some of the best eye specialists who said, this is, there's nothing we can do. It's incurable. Your son is going to go blind. And then he took him to Arigo. So this is, one of the biggest celebrities in Brazil, the biggest singer. And so he took his son to Arigo, and they didn't really ever say what happened or anything. But after that, after Arigo performed surgery on him, his sight was restored. And so I guess this guy would sometimes mention this surgery in his concerts, to tens of thousands of people. This brought Arigo even more fame and more attention. And he really was just completely idolized. There was all these articles written about him. Again, the second most famous person, worked for nearly 2 decades, treated over 300, almost 300 patients a day. So there were just thousands upon thousands of people who just, absolutely idolized this guy. But he did have a lot of enemies. And his main enemy was the Brazil Medical Association, because they wanted to lock him up for practicing medicine without a license. And they actually succeeded in locking him up for a while. And there was just this total outrage among the citizens of Brazil. They marched in the streets and everything, and he was eventually released. But the Brazil Medical Foundation still kept trying to basically catch Arigo in the act, because he obviously didn't have a medical license. And so they wanted to kind of catch evidence of him, operating on someone, maybe even get it on video, and, in this whole charade. And so what they did was they dispatched this guy. His name was Ari Lex, and he was a doctor himself, but he was also known for like exposing quackery and fraud. And that was kind of like his MO, was he would, investigate fraud cases and whatnot and expose them. And so they dispatched this Ari Lex guy to Arigo, and he watched Arigo operate on some people. And his quote was, "The only possible adjectives I can find to define this are spectacular and astounding." That was what he said after he witnessed Arigo perform an operation. He also said, "Without question, I can say I have observed for the first time a case of authentic paranormal phenomenon in my own field of medicine." And then the whole Brazil Medical Association also tried to take Arigo down by finding people who would come out to speak and say that Arigo had harmed them and he'd operate on them, and now they were, left disabled or left in a worse condition than they were. And again, he treated like hundreds of people a day for almost 2 decades. So there were plenty of people out there who'd been operated on by Arigo. And you would think that it would be easy to find someone who would have a bad thing to say, but they could not find anyone who would come forward with like a bad experience of being operated on by Arigo. And another real interesting thing is that he was very open. A lot of times, like voodoo or psychic surgery, sometimes it's called faith healing. It's kind of like this clandestine thing that's, maybe whispered about or rumored about, and, just not, it's kind of mysterious. Arigo wasn't like that at all. He wanted to be studied by science. He wanted scientists to come and observe him, and he wanted to be tested to figure out these powers, because he didn't understand it at all. He always claimed that he didn't remember anything after he was, he went into his trance and he was possessed by the spirit of Dr. Fritz. He didn't remember anything that happened. And it was even said that the first time he saw an operation that he himself was performing, because video cameras weren't that common, and these things weren't like video recorded until like the Americans, like Andrea Pujarich, started coming over. And it was said that when Arigo witnessed himself operating for the first time, when he was, possessed by Dr. Fritz, he fainted from the blood because he was just so astounded that he was the one doing this operation, slicing a dude open. Um, but he, again, was very open to being tested, and he even came to America once to have like preliminary tests done, and he was planning on coming back again or having a team come down to test him, more extensively with like really advanced equipment. And then he started telling all his friends that he kept seeing this black crucifix in his dreams and getting these visions of this black crucifix. And he became convinced that he was going to die soon. And it even reached the point where he would, see a friend and bid them goodbye and say, "This is the last time we'll ever see each other because I will be gone soon." And then on January 11th, 1971, Arrigo died in a car wreck. And it was a total national tragedy in Brazil when he died. It was front page news in every newspaper. And there's even kind of like some mystery surrounding his death because Andrea Puharich, the doctor who was working with Arrigo, he, in that presentation, in that talk about Arrigo that he gave, he talked about a phone call that he received when he learned that Arrigo had died. And it's a pretty interesting little bit of information. So I'll go ahead and play that video of him talking here real quick.
I'm back in the States, and the very strange part of the story is I got a call from Brazil. No, I'm sorry, a call from New York from some press, allegedly, people, and they said, "Have you heard that Arigo died?" I said, "No, I'm absolutely shocked." They said, "Do you have any comment?" I said, "No, I'm in a state of shock. Let me call you back. Give me your number." They gave me the number. I called up the Brazilian consulate whom I knew. I called up Rio. Nobody had any record of his being dead. And a person like that, the news would go around the world. Make a long story short, the actual fact is I got that call an hour before he died, checking out the time. And secondly, when I tried to call this mysterious party, there was no such party, there was no such telephone number. It was like zilch. So that alone was very, very spooky.
So that's definitely pretty interesting. And after Arrigo died, this actor Alan Arkin was going to make a movie about him. Again, Arigo never really became that popular in the United States. He died before that happened. Some of the other psychic surgeons we'll talk about did become somewhat pretty popular in the United States. But Arigo was more of a hero in Brazil. Alan Arkin was going to make a movie about him, and he has this quote in the corner there. He says, "Here was a simple man actually using." He talked about these videos, these recordings of Arigo operating on that he saw, and the reason, the inspiration for him making this movie. He said he was a simple man. Here was a simple man using a knife for his operations, wiping it clean on his shirt, and then removing a tumor from behind a man's eye. He did 6 such operations in 10 minutes, and by the time it was over, I tell you, I was ready to believe anything. This movie never did get made though. I'm not sure what happened. I couldn't find what happened to the movie. And another controversy that happened after Arrigo died is that people started coming forward claiming that they could channel this spirit of Dr. Fritz, the spirit that Arrigo would channel, and Dr. Fritz would operate on people. And people started coming forward after Arrigo died claiming that they could now channel this spirit, and they started treating people. And according to the Wikipedia page, 2 of Arrigo's brothers, Oscar and Edivalvo, claimed that they could channel Dr. Fritz, and they both also died in car crashes. I'm not sure if that's right or not. It could be. I also saw this Oscar Wilde referred to as like not related to Arrigo. So there's kind of a little discrepancies on whether these people who were, channeling this Dr. Fritz were in fact like Arrigo's brothers, as the Wikipedia entry claims, or if they were just, 2 people not related to Arrigo who could channel it and channel the spirit. There was another guy named Edson Quiores who claimed he could channel Dr. Fritz, and he died. One of his assistants basically just went crazy and killed him with a knife. Um, so it's kind of a strange thing how these people who, kind of took over the mantle for channeling Dr. Fritz and treating people, they all seem to die pretty violent deaths. Um, and then lastly, there was this quote from the book about Arigo that kind of talks about him as a whole. And I like the quote, so I figured I'd just share it real quick here. It says Arigo was amazing because he cut right through the entire spectrum. He was a god of the most important people in Brazil, as well as the poor and needy. I knew personally the wife of the director of the largest German mining combine with enormous interests in Brazil. She was miraculously cured after being given up as hopeless by the best doctors in Europe and America. And this whole Arigo story really is just an incredible story. The book written about him, it's by a guy named John Fuller. One of my favorite books. It's such a great book. Definitely recommend checking that out if you're interested in learning more. And next up, we'll be talking about Tony Apio. He's another really fascinating character, a bit of a controversial guy. He was a very, very popular psychic healer, and he was unique from Arigo because he really did become popular in the United States. Arigo never really became popular in the United States. The book about him was written after he'd already died. And while he was living, he was never really known in the United States at all. Tony Apio, on the other hand, really became popular in the United States and the Western world. And he was unique because he only used his hands. He did not use any sort of surgical instruments or anything like that. He was in the Philippines, and there were a ton of psychic healers in the Philippines at this time. This was kind of like ground zero for a lot of this whole psychic surgery movement. And like Arigo, he claimed he wasn't the one performing these surgeries. It was a spirit that was possessing him and using his body. It was the spirit that possessed him that gave him these powers. And again, he was unique because he only used his hands. He would never leave a scar or anything like that. He would just part the skin, put his hand inside, fish out a tumor, or perform whatever surgery he needed to perform with just his bare hands and send the patient on their way. And there was never any infection or anything like that. This has always been one of the real main mysteries about this whole psychic surgery phenomenon is why people didn't get like infections from these really unsanitary practices and really unsanitary conditions that these surgeries were being performed in. This passage here is from a book about psychic surgery, and it's a guy talking about his experience with Tony Apio. And he says, as he ran the fingers of his right hand over my abdomen, it opened up. They were in the woman's body almost instantly, probing for the growth. He took his hands away, and the two sides of the opening came together as though by magnetic attraction. The entire abdomen was as clean as though no operation had been performed. The woman sat up by herself and left the table. And like Arigo and all these other psychic surgeons, there were so many stories from people who were just left astounded, who'd come over to the Philippines to have Tony Apio operate on them and just totally blown away by what he had done. He took a tumor from my intestines in less than 5 minutes. I felt no pain and I'm well now. He even let me touch the insides of this woman through the incision. This man is no quack. There were a lot of people who were 100% convinced that this guy was totally legit. And all these articles and stories that started appearing in newspapers and in the United States and the Western world about this phenomenon of psychic surgery, almost all these really prominently featured Tony Apio. And he really did become pretty popular in the United States for a while. And one of the more incredible things that happened was that a group of 116 sick and deceased people from Detroit took like this pilgrimage to the Philippines to have Tony Apio operate on them. They chartered a flight, set up a whole trip, and 116 people went over to the Philippines to have him operate on all of them. And it was organized by this guy. His name was Joseph Ruffner, and he had broken his back in 1956. He was in excruciating pain. Doctors couldn't help him. They'd operated on him. Nothing could help him out or cure him. He could barely walk. and he read about psychic surgery. He read about Tony Apio in 1966 and went over to the Philippines to have him operate on him. And he describes the surgery. He gave a ton of interviews about his experience having Tony Apio operate on him. Here's kind of like the quote of him talking about the operation. I saw him cut into me with his bare hands and dig something out. A guy who said he was a doctor asked me if he could put his hand into my wound. I said it was okay by me if it was clean. He put his hand in and I could feel it. When he drew it out, it was covered in blood. Some doctors examined me first, and it seemed they couldn't believe what they had seen. And then he returned to his hotel after the operation, walking without pain and without his crutches for the first time in nearly a decade. And this guy was, pretty prominently featured in a lot of articles, and he was the one who kind of put together this whole pilgrimage to Detroit this whole pilgrimage from people from Detroit to the Philippines in 1966. Most of these people had been deemed incurable by their American doctors, everything from blind people to paralyzed people to a whole bunch of different ailments. And so they chartered this big flight and flew over to the Philippines. And one very interesting thing about this is that a reporter joined them. A reporter for the Detroit Free Press joined them to kind of document this whole trip and report on it for the news reporter and give running updates. And you just think about it. I mean, this could have potentially been one of the biggest stories of all time if these 116 people went over to the Philippines, sick, diseased, paralyzed, whatever, and returned and they'd been healed. This would have been, potentially an incredible story. And initially, the reporter who was writing about this, the reports he was filing were positive and talking about how people were saying that, yes, we've been helped by Tony Apio in these operations. And some of the reports were even like glowing. These are just a few kind of highlights from these articles that were being written. One man said, I don't think we've had more than 7 or 8 people at this point who feel like they have not been helped to any degree. Then there was one guy named Danny Williams, and he said, I don't know exactly what happened. I was in deep prayer, but it's something greater than man can understand. I am an electrical engineer, and I used to have to see to believe. Educated people cannot understand this type of thing. And then another lady said, I didn't believe until I got here, but I believe after the first treatment that Joey had, I would sell everything I own to do it again. But then the whole kind of narrative surrounding this trip, it changed almost suddenly, really, because Tony Apio didn't cure everyone who went on this trip. And this is kind of like one of the main controversies and mysteries surrounding psychic surgery is why some people are helped, sometimes to a miraculous degree, whereas other people just aren't healed at all or aren't helped at all. And we'll kind of get into this controversy and this whole mystery of why some are helped and some aren't. We'll get into that in the last part of the video. But the point is, the whole media coverage surrounding this trip really changed because he didn't cure everyone. And there were people who had mortgaged their houses, sold everything to go on this trip. And then they were really disappointed when they went over there and had an operation done and nothing happened. But the whole media coverage about Tony Apio being a quack and a fraud and psychic surgery being just a scam, it's honestly pretty misleading because these articles just sort of like cherry pick people to feature. Um, this article here at the top that says that, Tony Apio proves to be just another quack. The very first line of the article says 7 members of the group of some 100 ailing Detroit, Michigan residents who journeyed to the Philippines returned to Michigan and branded Apio a quack, the Detroit Free Press reported. So that's 7 people out of 116 people who made the trip. And these articles that talk about him being just a quack and a fraud only focus on those 7 people who said they had a bad experience and don't even really talk about the other 109 people. So it's kind of interesting how it's really kind of misleading to just focus on the negative and not even really talk about the other people. And even in this book, Psychic Surgery, the author Tom Valentine interviewed the reporter, the Detroit Free Press reporter who'd accompanied this trip. And even this reporter said he was asked how many people are think that they were helped by this psychic surgery that Tony Apio did, and he says about half of them are satisfied. The other half has some doubts, and I'd say about the third of the latter half are very unhappy. So, kind of the point is that this pilgrimage ended up being portrayed in the media as a total disaster. Tony Apio was labeled as a fraud, all based on this small percentage of people who went on this trip who were unsatisfied with that they hadn't been healed. And then another thing that happened is one guy ended up dying a couple weeks after he returned to Detroit. He had had like really bad cancer and he was pretty much on his deathbed. This trip to the Philippines was his sort of like last attempt at saving his life. He ended up dying like 2 weeks later. And then this article was everywhere after he died. This guy who went on this pilgrimage, he died. And so they wanted to open up like an investigation into the whole trip. And it almost just turned into like this big coordinated thing of just kind of ripping on these psychic surgeons and trying to take down this whole thing. And the tide really turned negative. It really does kind of seem like it was almost like a coordinated thing. Tony was still very popular, though. Tony Appiah was still very popular because plenty of people continued to say that he'd helped them and continued to relay all these amazing stories about what he'd done for them. And at one point, a group of Americans convinced him to come to America to see some people. And once he got to the United States, he was arrested and charged with fraud. And so he was arrested, and then he posted bail and he jumped to the Philippines. So he jumped bond, and this kind of further tarnished his reputation because he was kind of seen as, this fugitive on the run. And again, it just kind of seemed like there was this coordinated effort to take him down. The whole thing really kind of turned into a bit of a mess because even with this negative attention, people would still flock to him. A lot of them claimed they'd been healed by him. And the thing was, Tony had been operating on people in the Philippines forever, for years. It was a very common thing over there. And once the Americans got involved with this whole thing, it kind of just turned into a mess. There were people who wanted to profit off of him. And a lot of people started kind of working with him. Some claimed they wanted to help Tony, like expand his business. Some claimed they wanted to study him. Some people wanted to profit off of him. And he was kind of convinced that some people were really trying to take him down and trying to ruin him. And he just kind of felt like there were all these different factions that either wanted to capitalize on his talent or just take him down and totally ruin him. And one reason that he's always kind of been considered a little controversial is that he did accept donations for these operations that he would perform. Arigo would never accept money. A lot of the other psychic surgeons would never accept money. They were just doing it, because it was the grace of God or whatever. But Tony Apio did accept donations. He didn't charge anything, but if people wanted to donate, they could, and he would accept it. And this kind of made him a controversial character, and he was even kicked out of this group Espiritista. Now, this is the group that it was kind of like this group that just worked together to develop their psychic abilities. It was almost like a training school, really. And he'd worked with them, and this is how he kind of got his psychic abilities really developed. They kicked him out of the group after he started accepting donations from patients because they felt it was wrong to even accept donations, even if people were offering. And even with this whole controversy, he was still popular, and a lot of people would donate, a pretty significant amount of money because they felt their lives had been saved by him. And so he ended up opening up like a healing clinic that was pretty nice. And, this kind of furthered the allegations, I guess, that he was a fraud who was just scamming people out of money. Um, and then he died in 1982, January 30th, 1982. He was only 42 years old. He was very young. Arigo was very young as well. He was only 49 when he died. So that's kind of a common theme among some of these faith healers is that they die at a very young age. And then the third kind of main psychic surgeon who got popular around this time is this lady Pachita. And she's very interesting as well. She was out of Mexico. And like all these other psychic surgeons, she didn't use anesthesia. She didn't sterilize her equipment, nothing like that. And she's pretty well known in like Mexican folklore. She's, kind of been covered and talked about over the years. And actually, Andrea Puharich, who studied Arigo, who we played the video from earlier, he also spent a lot of time with Pachita. And he was even more amazed by Pachita than he was by Arigo. And he has a video clip that he kind of talks about his experience witnessing Pachita operate on people and just kind of the things he witnessed. And so we'll play that clip here real quick.
I was in Mexico. This was in 72, 73, and I found another woman who operated just like Arigo, except the difference, her name was Pachita, and she was very old, been doing this for 50 years. The difference between her and Arigo, which Arigo never did, she would transplant human organs from cadavers, which doctors would furnish her, and implant them into people. And I watched hundreds of these operations, and there was no rejection phenomenon. Example, a woman had had a hysterectomy for some cockamamie reason, which is the usual case, and she now wanted children. So she'd come to Pachita and say, I'd like to have a baby, but I don't have a uterus. Oh, okay, we'll get you a uterus. How much is it? 50 pesos, whatever. But that's the money that Pachita had to pay the doctors, to get the specimen from the university hospital, etc. So a uterus would be brought over and was put in a mason jar, stuck in a family refrigerator, and there it sat until the patient came along. And then the patient, when she came, was laid on the table and just slid over with a big knife, and this incredible big hunting knife, all black with years of surgery, never cleaned, just like Arigo's thing, oxidized to death. And she just slid her open. The knife would go in about 4 inches, no pain. The patient would be looking at the ceiling. And she'd take this uterus and she'd plop it in. I'm saying plop in. With no attempt to line anything, no attempt to put sutures in, no attempt to, restore the vascular bed. Unbelievable. You just couldn't believe it when you're looking at it. And anyway, then I followed the case, and sure enough, a couple of months later, she still had the uterus, hadn't rejected it, and she'd get pregnant. I followed her, and she'd have a baby. And she'd do that. The funny stories you can't believe. And she transplanted all kind of organs, including brain operation. It was just unbelievable, how she...
And as Andrea Puharich mentioned, Pachita differed because she would do entire transplants, organ transplants, and really major operations. And she also differed because she would perform exorcisms and prescribe herbal remedies, a whole bunch of things like ancient spices and dried snakes, and really kind of unconventional medicines that she claimed help exorcise demons from the body or help people get better if they were sick. And she's also interesting because there were a couple people who really spent a ton of time around Pachita, studying with her and observing her. And so these were two books that were written about Pachita. This book on the left here, The Beautiful Side of Evil, is by this lady named Joanna Michelson. And she claimed that she got really big into, developing her psychic abilities and studying with groups that helped her develop them. And through some of these groups, she had been put in touch with Pachita, and she claimed that Pachita told her that the spirit that possessed Pachita said to Pachita that this Joanna Michelson was going to be Pachita's apprentice. And this Joanna Michelson was going to be the person who took over for Pachita after Pachita had passed away. And so she started assisting Pachita in a lot of her operations and kind of helping her out. And she did this for about a year and helped with just hundreds of, major surgeries and major operations. And the real interesting thing is that after this year studying with Pachita and observing her, she became convinced that the spirit that Pachita was tapping into and the spirit that was possessing her and performing these surgeries, became convinced that this spirit was evil and very malevolent. This spirit was known as Hermanito. And she became convinced that this Hermanito was a very malevolent, evil spirit who was deceiving people. She noticed how some people were healed by these operations and surgeries that were being performed, but she also noticed that some people endured some just horrible experiences during their time, with Pachita operating on her. And again, this is kind of one of the main controversies with this whole psychic surgery phenomenon that we'll talk about it in a bit. Why some people are healed and have incredible experiences and have nothing but positive things to say, and other people just have awful, awful experiences and have nothing good to say at all. Um, but in this book, The Beautiful Side of Evil, one of the people who Pachita had operated on, who had a really bad experience, was a writer. And so they contributed a little write up of what they'd experienced. And it was included in this book. I'll just read it here real quick. So, this writer, had spent years in constant agonizing pain, had undergone 16 operations, 4 severe ones on her spine before seeing Hermanito. And Hermanito was the spirit that possessed Pachita. And then so her recounting of her experience with Pachita operating on her back, she says, "Hell could not be worse than what I experienced that night. I felt the knife go into my back, down into my spine. The pain was searing and hideous. I kept screaming to God. I knew suddenly I was in the hands of great evil. I felt intense hatred from him towards me. The only explanation I have for this is that I am very committed to Christ. Hermanito must have sensed that." So again, most people, when these operations were going on, didn't feel a thing. And that was not the case for this lady, unfortunately. um, and it is really curious that this writer who talked about her horrible experience here, mentions that this Hermanito was actually a great, very malevolent, evil presence, because this Joanna Michelson ended up leaving, even though Pachita claimed that she was going to be her apprentice and her understudy and would eventually start performing these surgeries herself and having Hermanito take over her body. She became convinced that the spirit that was possessing Pachita was evil. And so she left after a year. And then Pachita finally died. She died in 1979, just a few years before Tony Agpaoa, a few years after Arigo died. And even with, the bad experiences that some have, like that writer recounted, there were so many people who claimed that Pachita had helped them, saved their lives. Just there's like Arigo and Tony Agpaoa, there's just so many incredible stories from people who underwent operations from Pachita and talked about the things they'd experienced. Both of these two books are really good books. Again, they're written by people who worked firsthand with Pachita and talked about their experiences and the amazing things they've seen. So definitely recommend reading those two if you want to learn a bit more about Pachita. And then we'll just talk a bit about the controversy surrounding psychic surgery. And believe me, it was very controversial. You had some people singing the praises of it and saying that their lives had been saved, and their psychic surgeon, comparing their psychic surgeons to, greatest healer since Christ. You had other people who returned to the United States claiming nothing had happened and they'd been totally scammed out of their money. And so there was a big, wide variety of opinions here, and definitely a huge controversy around the legitimacy of psychic surgery at the time. And even today, this whole debate about whether psychic surgery is legit or not still kind of rages on. If you look at the Wikipedia page for psychic surgery, this is how they define psychic surgery. Psychic surgery is a pseudoscientific medical fraud in which practitioners create the illusion of performing surgery with their bare hands and use sleight of hand, fake blood, and animal parts. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission describes psychic surgery as a total hoax. So, needless to say, Wikipedia, not a fan of psychic surgery. and seems maybe a little slightly biased. They don't really mention anything about the thousands upon thousands of people who were helped by this, or some of the just incredible things that a lot of people witness these psychic surgeons do. And then there was this guy, his name is James Randi. He was a professional magician in this era, and he was kind of like a debunker. He claimed all psychic phenomena was a hoax. It was all fake, not just psychic surgery, but all psychic phenomenon. And he pretty much devoted his career to like debunking, quote unquote, psychic phenomena. And so he has a couple videos out there where he, quote unquote, debunks psychic surgery and shows how it could be faked. Doesn't really prove anything, if you ask me. All he's doing is demonstrating, well, if people did want to fake it, this is how they would do it. And I mean, that seems like jumping to quite a bit of a jump to conclusions to just say this is how it is faked or can be faked. Therefore, every single person who does this is a fake. And this James Randi guy is pretty controversial. This is Andrea Puharich, who we talked about earlier, and he talked about James Randi claiming this whole thing is fake. He said, "Do you know about Randy? Randy works for the Disinformation Department in the Department of Defense High Level Research Projects. He started working there in 1973. He makes things difficult for legitimate psychic researchers. We can never get Randy to debate publicly. Peter Herkos, the psychic, and myself have challenged him, and he won't deal with us. Yet the average Joe would say Geller's a fake. Randy proved it. So they've done a good job, the Disinformation Squad, but it's all horseshit. But what does kind of complicate things is that there definitely were frauds and con artists who started to emerge in this as this whole psychic surgery thing got really popular in the 1960s, and Westerners from the United States and Europe and other countries started coming over because there was a lot of money involved. And so there were kind of like various scams and con artists who popped up. And I mean, even in one book, it was kind of like described how the scam worked, where taxi drivers would be in on it, hotel workers would be in on it. And whenever like a Westerner would come over and ask for a recommendation on a psychic surgeon or ask to be taken to Tony Agpaoa, the taxi driver would take him to someone else who was just posing as him. They'd put on a big show about doing psychic surgery, but not really do anything, and then charge the person a ton of money and just pocket it. So there were con artists and scam artists who did emerge as this became popular. But again, that doesn't prove that every single person was faking it. And it certainly doesn't explain why there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who were helped by this, saved by this, had their lives totally changed by this psychic surgery. And this Tom Valentine guy who wrote this psychic surgery book talked to a ton of people who had not only had psychic surgery done, but had been like part of groups who'd gone over there. And based on all the people he'd talked to, he estimated that the ratio was about 70 to 30. 70% of people were just had been totally healed or helped by psychic surgery. 30% hadn't. So again, if 70% of people are being helped by this, I don't see how you can just claim it's one big fraud. So they clearly healed tons of people, and the main mystery is how did they do it? How did they, operate on people without anesthesia or sterilization and just open them right up then and there, spend a few minutes performing a surgery and then closing the wound up without leaving a scar and sending them on their way? How was this possible that they could do something like this? And again, all these psychic surgeons claimed they weren't the ones who were actually performing these surgeries. They were just mediums. They would enter into a trance, and then a spirit would take over their body. And it was the spirit who was, performing these operations and healing these people. And one thing that's kind of important to note is that these people, these psychic surgeons, really did work at developing their psychic ability. uh, some of the books on Tony Agpaoa go into extensive detail about like his almost like a training regimen. He would disappear in the mountains for weeks at a time to meditate. He would, meditate for hours a day. He would go on fasts for weeks at a time because he said all doing all these things helped him like develop his psychic abilities. Same with Arigo. He had been involved in meditation and entering into trances since he was a youth. Pachita was the same. So it was kind of believed that since these people spent all this time developing their psychic skills, they had almost like overdeveloped minds and overdeveloped psychic abilities. And that's what enabled them to access these entities, or these entities, spirits, whatever you want to call them, who took over their body. And another explanation that some people believe is that these psychic surgeons were actually operating on and curing the astral body and not the physical body. So basically, we have both a physical and an astral body. The astral body is kind of like the soul, you could probably say. And the thinking is that many diseases originate in the spiritual body, in the astral body, and then it just manifests itself as a physical condition in the physical body. And this is true for some, not all illnesses or diseases or conditions, but it's true for some that people believe that it originates in the astral body. That's the root cause of it. And so the thinking was that these higher consciousnesses that took over the body of these psychic surgeons and operated on people actually lived on this other higher astral plane, and they could actually heal and access this second astral body of people. And that's where the true root of the disease lied. And then by healing the astral body, this would also heal the physical body as well. And another thing that's talked about a lot in these books on psychic surgery is the importance of the patient's mindset or their attitude, and how that plays a huge role in the effectiveness of the healing. Again, not everyone was healed by these psychic operations. Not everyone was, healed by these psychic surgeons. The Tom Valentine book estimated it was 70% were and 30% weren't. So, the question people have asked is, well, why is there that discrepancy? Why are some people healed and some aren't? And time again, it's talked about how the patient's mindset is the thing that really kind of sets apart a successful operation or a successful treatment from a not successful treatment. And so here's a few quotes just from this book about Tony Agpaoa talking about that. And he says, many times Tony has claimed that the attitude of the patient is just as important as the work of the healer in bringing about a total cure. And he says, yes, I merely plant the seed. The mind of the patient really provides the cure, said Tony. And he was even said that it was more difficult for these psychic surgeons to operate on Westerners as opposed to native Filipinos, because native Filipinos had a different mindset going into these surgeries. They genuinely believed it would help. It's something that had been going on for decades over there. It was very common for them. Whereas Westerners who were coming over, it was a totally foreign concept. They were nervous, apprehensive, or maybe they just didn't even believe that this would do anything, period. And so I guess it was much more difficult to operate on these people who kind of had a more negative mindset than it was the native Filipinos. And this kind of leads into the final strange thing we'll talk about. It has to do with Tony Agpaoa, who we mentioned was pretty controversial. And part of the controversy around him is that he did accept donations. He didn't charge anything, but he would accept donations if people, wanted to give them after a psychic surgery operation. And this was really frowned upon by a lot of people in the psychic surgery community. But honestly, the main reason he was considered so controversial was just that he was so popular. He was the guy who really broke through and gained popularity in the United States and the Western world. And one of the real bizarre aspects to his story, and it kind of ties into the importance of the patient's mindset. And this is something that a few people witnessed as they were witnessing Tony operate on people. Because some people who really studied this phenomenon claimed that in a lot of cases, the blood or even the surgery wasn't even necessary. It was all just done for show. It was done to get the patients to believe. Because if they didn't believe that they'd actually been cured or fixed or whatever, then the operation wouldn't have any effect. And so this little snippet here from a book about psychic surgery, it's the conversation between two people who were observing Tony. And so the one lady says, but you say Tony doesn't really have to make a display of blood? And the other guy responds, he says not. The way he explained it to me is he is in and out of the body so fast. Many patients and their friends and relatives don't believe that he's actually done anything. But if they can go home with blood splattered undergarments, they can prove that they really had an operation. And this kind of ties in with something that has oftentimes been held up as like evidence that he was a fraud or a quack. And it has to do with, again, that pilgrimage from Detroit to the Philippines, where there were like 116 people who went over there. So one of the guys who came back to Detroit, he kept the shorts that he was wearing during his operation, and they were covered in blood. And he sent them to a lab, and it came back as testing for animal blood. It wasn't human blood on his shorts, it was animal blood. And so this was kind of held up as evidence that, well, Tony faked this whole thing. He just used fake blood. He didn't actually do anything. And he's, just a quack. But it's interesting because this lady, her name is Pamela Day Margaret, and she had an operation done by Tony, and he'd fixed her up. She went back home to the States, told all her friends, just raved about the experience. And she eventually quit her job and moved to the Philippines just so she could observe Tony Agpaoa full time. And so she witnessed him do hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of operations. And one thing she noticed was that occasionally he would have like a little vial of blood that he would crack open and splash onto a patient. And this totally confused her because she'd also seen him perform like legit major operations. And so she didn't understand why sometimes he would almost seem to be faking it. And so she says here, yeah, supposedly they crack vials of chicken blood so it looks like the blood from a body opening. And she asked him about it, and he said, God heals magnetically. It's the patient who needs to believe there was an operation. So again, it always seems to tie into this whole notion of the patient having to believe. And the kind of the general belief was that, these psychic surgeons, because they were tapped into this higher power, they could basically tell when a patient actually needed surgery, and then if they did need surgery, they would perform that surgery. But then they could also tell if it was just all in the patient's mind. And if it was all in the patient's mind, they would just fake the operation and make it seem like they'd done something and convince the patient that they'd been fixed. And in a lot of instances, that was enough to cure the patient. Even this other instance, they Tony and all the other psychic surgeons, they never left a scar or anything like that. And then this Pamela Day Margaret lady also witnessed a psychic surgeon perform the operation, but they left a scar. They purposely left a scar there that wouldn't heal for like 2 weeks, they said. And she was confused by that. She said, well, why did you leave the scar? And they said, well, there's too much doubt that they have. Now this scar is their proof. This scar is, the proof that something had actually been done. And so it's really interesting how sometimes the surgery would be performed. I mean, there are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of stories of people being operated and witnesses seeing this and even video of it. But then other times they would actually just fake the operation because the patient's belief was enough to heal them. And there's all these like weird, confusing things about this whole psychic surgery thing. One of them is that these psychic surgeons were not allowed to operate on family members at all. They claimed these spirits that they were tapping into wouldn't allow them to operate on any of their family members. I guess it maybe has to do with like not benefiting from these powers in any way. But Pachita lost a couple children at a very young age, and people asked her like, well, if you're this huge amazing psychic surgeon who can save people's lives, why didn't you save your son's life? And she said, well, the spirit, my hermanito, wouldn't let me. The same was true for Tony Agpaoa. He lost a child at a very young age. So there's all these just little strange, confusing, almost like rules for this psychic surgery thing. The whole thing is just very interesting. I find it to be one of the more fascinating topics, and some of these books I've read on psychic surgery are just some of the most fascinating books I've read in quite some time. I do also find it just so interesting how, throughout the 1960s, just how popular this became in the Western world. Again, this has always gone on in these underdeveloped third world countries. It wasn't considered abnormal or fringe or anything like that. But it's just so interesting to me how, for a stretch, this really became popular in the Western world during the 1960s. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you soon.